Hello and welcome to the Policy Wall at ORF Middle East. Today we have with us Dr. Neil Quilliam, who is a foreign affairs specialist with extensive experience consulting with government officials, corporate clients on geopolitics, energy issues in the Middle East. He is an associate fellow in the MENA program at Chatham House, partner at Azure Strategy, and the energy director at SRMG Think. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So today we'll be focusing on the regional dynamics in the Middle East. So to begin, the Middle East strategic landscape has shifted dramatically in the past year, from new normalization deals to emerging economic corridors. What do you see as the primary forces, both regional as well as extra-regional, that is driving this realignment?
I mean, there are a number of factors driving this. First, domestically and specifically within the Gulf. Over the past few years, we've seen the Gulf Arab states, primarily Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, very much sort of coming into their own, becoming middle powers and becoming much more assertive, engaging players, particularly within the sort of the regional space, within the security framework, but also sort of at the economic level. Their visions, 2030, for example, in Saudi Arabia, is a key driver for economic activity and economic change. So we've seen a very much kind of a building out and a deepening of their engagement in the region. Secondly, we've seen Israel move from a position where perhaps it was tolerating, managing its relations with Iran. But ever since October the 7th, 2023, we've seen it reestablish its deterrent capability and, in fact, act much more aggressively than that and push, obviously, right up into Lebanon against Hezbollah, into Syria, striking the Houthis. And we've recently seen the conflict directly between Israel and Iran. So Israel has moved into that space and really changed and shifted the balance of power and that dynamic. At the same time, we've seen a period of rapprochement as well, shaping the region, primarily between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We've seen Saudi and Turkey, that relationship develop, as we've equally seen the same with the UAE, with Turkey and Iran. So you've got this confluence of factors, the Gulf states driving and pushing for change because they really want to develop their economies and they're really looking, to the future. We've seen Israel reestablish a deterrent position and really enforce itself in the region. But at the same time, we've seen this de-escalation between the Arab states and Iran and with Turkey. And then, of course, we've seen the collapse of the Assad regime. These are a lot of factors that are playing out at once.
That's very interesting. And I think something that you mentioned that I really want to pick up on is the role of the Gulf states. The GCC has spearheaded much of this realignment initiative, especially on the trade corridors, normalization deals, and collective security. Yet, we do see that the members often pursue divergent agendas that aligns more closely with their national priorities. Firstly, do you agree that there is this friction between national and collective priorities in the GCC? And secondly, how do these differing priorities undermine the GCC's ability to deliver regional stability?
So first, yes, I agree. There are frictions between sort of national priorities and collective priorities or agendas, but I think that's the same the world over. Whenever one joins a club, there's always a friction between what an individual or an individual country wants to do and what the collective. So this is a very natural state of affairs. It's not peculiar or particular to the GCC. What I've seen, I think, emerging through the GCC states and through the GCC organization over the years is almost a sort of bifurcation of responsibilities. We've seen, the national states very much driving ahead with the national agendas, and that's primary. I mean, there are clear sort of economic, geo-economic, and strategic interests that they want to pursue in their own interest. And I think the GCC as a vehicle for representing sort of strong economic, strong security, strong collective action has somewhat diminished over time. And we can see some of the GCC member states, for example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have differing interests when it comes to foreign policy priorities in countries such as Sudan. But what I do see in the GCC, and I think as the organization, and I think what we've seen over time, is that it's becoming more of a sort of perfunctory technocratic organization, and it's serving an important function in sort of smoothing trade between the 6 countries, in making sure there's standardization throughout the 6 countries. And we can see issues like anti-dumping at the moment. There's a growing and an emerging anti-dumping policy that's emerging from the states themselves, but that's operating through the GCC. So I see the GCC less, no longer sort of playing high politics, if you like, but being a forum where the low politics of the GCC states themselves is carried out. It's like the software almost, the meshing between the economies, between the trade, working on standardizing also AI, standardizing cyber. So those kind of things that kind of happen under the table. So there's that bifurcation, and I think those two things sit quite comfortably together, and they will become very distinctive areas, I think, where those GCC states come together in the organization to operate, but they will still want that degree of autonomy to pursue their independent national priorities.
Right, exactly. There is this sort of growing friction between what they want to do nationally and but what is also great for the region. And one of the other things that I feel collectively the GCC wants to be doing is regional stability. I think that is a very important objective for the GCC. One of the other initiatives that the GCC has put their weight behind is rebuilding Syria, especially Saudi Arabia, which brokered the meeting between President Trump and President Al Shara. So, and we saw that President Trump has recently ordered sanction relief for Syria and has urged Syria's accession to the Abraham Accords. However, given Syria's deeply fragile internal landscape, how realistic is this accession? And even if it succeeds, how would the Syrian normalization reshuffle the power equations in the region, according to you?
Thank you. I mean, it's a great and it's a very important question, and there are sort of three ways to look at it. First is stabilization itself of Syria, and you're absolutely right. All 6 GCC states want to see a stable and successful Syria. They all have a vested interest in that. There was a sense of regret that they didn't play such a role in Iraq in a sort of post-2003 environment, and ultimately, there was a feeling that they lost the ability to influence or shape policy within Iraq, and they'd lost that primarily to Iran. So this is an opportunity in which they can all conceivably work together. There will be times when they work in competition against each other, I think, within Syria, but there's a collective good in stabilizing Syria and pushing it in the right direction, and making sure that it not only remains stable, but it sort of remains within the Arab fold and is no longer sort of part of sits within Iran's orbit. And there is a sort of deconfliction and a cooperation between the GCC states themselves and Turkey in that space. And I think that project itself is very difficult. It's very complex. Syria has been at war for the last 13, 14 years, and there are deep fractions and fissures beneath the surface. So that's going to take a lot of time, effort, political will, and faith and patience to help cohere and build that state. Now, there is talk of normalization. And for me, talk of normalization just seems so far-fetched at the moment, given the challenges that al-Shara has in bringing the country together, in working with the SDF. We know they had a meeting yesterday. there are so many issues to work through, and then managing the normalization space. I'm not sure whether they have the capacity to do so, but clearly, the US really wants to push on this and really wants to drive this ahead, and it will expect, I think, something in return for lifting sanctions, and for Trump for really sort of putting his shoulder behind behind the wheel for Syria. I mean, there's a lot of discussion what normalization might look like. I don't think Israel is ever going to want to give up the Golan. It annexed that in 81. Trump, during his first term, recognized that annexation. It's hard to imagine what Syria could conceivably offer Israel at the moment, because it's in such a weak position to recover the Golan Heights. It seems to me, as a long-term observer of Syria, almost inconceivable that Syria would want to give up the Golan, because that's an integral part of it and its history and territory. However, I mean, I have heard opinions expressed particularly from young Syrians that this desire to hold on to Golan is very much a part of the past, very much a part of the sort of the Ba'athist and Assad era. So there may be some flexibility around that, but I find it very hard to believe that Syria is going to manage to cohere itself and put together a sufficient package to entice Israel. And I don't think Israel is going to be able to cross all the T's and dot all the I's and come to an agreement that al-Sharaa can send to its people. There are far too many sort of fractures and fissures and complications in this piece. Very easy to talk about, very easy to say, but moving this forward, I think, will be extremely and exceptionally different, unless there is some form of wider, comprehensive peace that's pushed. And we saw earlier in the week, the Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, Lana Nusebi, in an op-ed with the FT, talking about sort of an all-encompassing peace process. But even if we were to push for that, and that included Turkey and that included Iran, I mean, getting a huge process like that underway, having the will to see it through, the will to implement it, it just seems a bridge too far to me.
Right. I think I would have to agree that while it seems like this is something that Trump is really trying to put his weight behind, it would be hard to actually realize it, given how politically difficult it would be to sell any kind of agreement to the domestic population, especially for Syria. Um, Syria is one of those actors that is currently very active in the region. So is Israel. But one of the actors that it has been relatively quiet is Iraq. And that is something that you have written about quite recently for ORF Middle East. And I do want to speak about that article a little bit. That Iraq will continue to be impacted with the fall of Assad and possibly even the Syrian normalization. But despite these recent Israel Iran flare ups, including reports of an Iranian attack on the US bases in Iraq, Baghdad has remained largely on the sidelines. So, what explains this silence, or shall I say, strategic silence? And what are the internal dynamics and external pressures that are keeping Iraq from taking a very clear stance?
It's a very important question, and I mean, for so long, the whole world had been watching Iraq, and Iraq had been the absolute focus, for a good 15 years, and Iraq was the story in the region. And in fact, that sort of dynamic has shifted and changed over the past few years. But Iraq has continued to develop, to move along quite quietly, almost out of the limelight. Its economy has started to recover. Its security apparatus has, and the PMF groups in particular, we call them sort of, interstate actors. I mean, they have one foot within the state system, and they have a large degree of autonomy. So they manage to sort of straddle that strange world between being a state actor and a non-state actor. But their own business interests over the past few years have begun to grow. Their own business interests are basically tied and are tied quite closely to the well-being of the economy. So the domestic situation to a certain extent has settled down. The economy has started to grow. And I do travel to Iraq, and I see my Iraqi colleagues often, and they love to talk about this burgeoning restaurant and cafe culture. They talk of Iraq not being like this since before 2003. There's a real optimism, and we see that very much here in London because we often have Iraqi business delegations coming through. So Iraq is growing, Iraq is developing out of the limelight, and that's one factor. I don't think the Iraqi political leadership, I don't think the groups, the non-state armed groups really want to disrupt the progress that's being made at the moment, because their interests are embedded and enveloped within that. But also, of course, I mean, Israel's response to October 23, less so in Gaza, but most certainly, its degrading of Hezbollah, which was intelligence-led, was also quite a shock. I think, Israel's capability to undo Hezbollah, to diminish it into, well, it's still recovering. We don't quite know what shape it's in. Its willingness to strike directly against Iran. And whilst obviously Iran responded quite forcibly, but to withstand that, withhold that, and continue its actions almost with impunity. There are very few constraints on what Israel is willing to do. And I think that also sent a very strong message to armed non-state actors in Iraq that if they engage in this conflict, there's a very strong chance that an intelligence-led operation by Israel will attack and diminish them. And of course, I mean, Iraq had suffered the attack against Soleimani back in 2021, Abu Muhandis too. So they know that this capability. So I think they stayed on the sidelines. One, because I think it's in their economic interest to do so. But two, because a response at this time would likely lead to a degrading of their capability as well. So much better just to sort of keep the head down. There may be a response at some point. We certainly can't rule that out. But for the time being, focus on domestic matters and try to get the country into a better place, rather than being dragged into a war or a conflict that can't be won. And they would also have taken note. Obviously, we saw the Assad regime fall very, very quickly and be removed. But we've also seen Israeli strikes inside Syria take place at will. There is no capability for Syrian forces to prevent these. So it's clear that at the moment, with Israel enjoying effectively air superiority in the region, that Iraqi groups do not want to take that on for the time being.
Yes, and I feel like, I think that has been Iraq's strategy, and it's also as the different actors are interacting with each other, the region is becoming a little bit more volatile, especially with the new developments. So it would be sensible to just see how these actors continue to interact with each other, how these power equations evolve before making any strong and significant moves. So
And
to that point, sorry.
if I could just add one point on that as well, there are elections in November coming up as well. So I think the domestic constituency and the domestic parties are very much looking looking ahead to that as well. That's going to set the policy for the next 4 or 5 years. So that is of major interest to all those players. So it's not in their interests to drag Iraq into a conflict at this particular time.
Yes, exactly. And that is a very important aspect of the domestic calculus for Iraq. Um, but looking ahead, and this is my final question, how do you see these regional actors interacting? Which emerging fault lines or potential convergence points should we watch for to see whether this realignment cements or it unravels?
Thank you. That's a great and a penetrating question. I mean, because as I've sort of said throughout and in our discussion, that there's so many moving pieces and moving points to this. I mean, we've shifted from a time when during the first Trump presidency, we were looking at normalization, and then we've had this period now of intense regional conflict where there has been concern around about the prospect of an all-out war. We've seen the de-escalation between Iran and the Gulf states, de-escalation between Gulf states and Turkey, and we've seen the collapse in Syria, of course. So you've got all these moving pieces, but we're now back to talking about normalization again. So we can almost have this arc, but what I think we should be looking out for really is there'll be a lot of media attention, there'll be a lot of policy attention on normalization. But if I can just put that on hold for the time being, I think the Gulf states' relationships with Iran and Turkey is going to be critical. Iran has suffered a major setback. We don't know to what extent that's happened on its nuclear program, but most certainly, it's lost its forward defense posture at the moment. So it's in a weaker position than it's been for a very long time. And I think the Gulf states will want to capitalize upon that, not to exacerbate the weakness, but to utilize this moment to sort of strengthen and embed ties closer than they've had before. Now that may seem counterintuitive because there is the drive towards normalization, and one would think, well, this creates an environment where Israel could conceivably normalize with Saudi Arabia, it could normalize with Syria, but there are a couple of big issues that will frustrate that matter. One is Gaza, of course. We're still, there are early signs this morning that there may be signs of a ceasefire coming through, but until there is a durable and sustainable peace, ceasefire in Gaza, until Israel stops further effectively annexing the West Bank, and until there is a real commitment towards a two-state solution, I don't see Saudi Arabia being able to normalize. There's a concern in the region at the moment that, yes, Israel has reestablished its deterrent. Yes, it's probably a partner that some of the other Gulf states and Syria may wish to work with, given its advances in technology, given its advances in cyber, given its advances in its economy, its entrepreneurialism. There's a lot on offer. But Israel's actions over the past 18 months are also a cause for concern. And I think that in itself may slow down or may diminish appetites for quickly normalizing. So I see two kind of currents, essentially. One is that move to work more closely with Iran, to utilize this moment to reestablish the terms of the relationships, build on those de-escalatory moments, and there's one towards normalization. But I see greater problems and greater issues with normalization. And just to come back to the point about President Trump, he may have this ambition, and to sort of resolve a lot of these issues all at once. But I think back to the period in 1991, 92, when we had the Madrid conference after the Gulf War, I mean, the US was the unipolar power at the time. All of the regional states were weakened, but the US even then could not really drive through a comprehensive package of deals amongst all of those states. So I don't see President Trump being able to do this. He may be able to sort of paper over some of the conflictual points, but these issues are long running and deep. And then finally, just to make a point, that I used the term middle powers earlier in our conversation. It's clear that the 6 GCC states are part of this emerging middle power alternative to the two other poles in the world, and that's really driven by a need to diversify their economies, transform and transition. And I think that is something that is only going to continue to grow. And we're going to see greater connectivity between those states and India, for example. And then also through IMEC. I think the geo-economic connectivity coming from the region is going to boom, is really going to expand. And I think that's going to be a big driver. And as a corollary of that, we're going to see those states becoming even more active mediators, not just in the Middle East, but beyond that. They will use their tools to mediate conflicts all around the world. And we've already seen the Qataris doing that in South America.
Yes, and that is great. I think that is very, very insightful of how these regional alignments will change in the future. Thank you so much, Neil. This was really helpful, and I'm sure our viewers would enjoy this as much as I did.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation and the great questions. Thank you.